I want to say up front that I don't know how to make this sound less strange than it is. I've tried writing it out a few different ways, and every version either sounds like I'm exaggerating for effect or like I'm leaving out the parts that actually mattered. So I'm just going to tell it the way it happened in order as close to the way I lived it as I can manage. If some of it sounds boring, that's because most of working overnight at a place like this is boring. The boring parts are why the rest of it got under my skin the way it did. I worked the night shift at a retirement home for a little over 2 years. I'm not going to use the real name of the facility, partly because I signed paperwork when I left that I'd rather not test, and partly because I don't think the name matters. Places like it exist in every town. Long beige hallways, handrails on both walls, a smell that's somewhere between hand sanitizer and microwaved soup that never quite goes away, no matter how many times housekeeping mops. If you've ever visited a relative in one of these places during visiting hours, you've seen maybe 10% of what it's actually like. The other 90% happens after the families go home, and the lights in the common areas get switched to the dimmer overnight setting. I took the job because I needed something that paid better than retail and didn't require a 4-year degree I didn't have yet. I was 26. I'd been doing the overnight stocking shift at a grocery store for about a year before that, so I was already wired to function on an upside-down schedule, sleeping through the daylight and feeling normal somewhere around 11 at night. The retirement home was hiring for what they called a night care associate, which is a fairly generous title for someone whose main jobs were checking on residents, helping with bathroom trips, restocking supply carts, and making sure nobody wandered into a hallway they weren't supposed to be in. I wasn't a nurse. I want to be clear about that early, because some of what's coming might make it sound like I had more medical training than I did. I had a CNA certification, which is the basic certified nursing assistant license, the kind that lets you change a dressing or help someone transfer from a bed to a wheelchair, but it doesn't make you qualified to interpret what was actually going on with some of these people's minds. That distinction is going to matter later. The facility had 3 wings, named with the kind of cheerful, meaningless branding that places like this love. Sunrise Wing, Magnolia Wing, and Heritage Wing. Heritage was the memory care unit, locked doors, key fob access, residents with moderate to advanced dementia. I worked mostly in Sunrise and Magnolia, which housed people who were there for assisted living rather than full memory care, though there's a wide gray area in that population. Some of the Sunrise residents were sharper than I was at 3 in the morning. Others had good days and bad days, the way anyone's grandparent might. A little more forgetful some nights than others, occasionally calling you by the wrong name, occasionally completely lucid and asking you detailed questions about your own life that put my memory to shame. My usual shift ran from 11 at night to 7 in the morning, 4 nights a week, sometimes 5 if someone called out. There were 2 of us on for most of that stretch, sometimes 3 depending on staffing, plus whichever charge nurse was assigned. The facility kept a skeleton crew overnight because most residents slept through it, at least in theory. In practice, a meaningful number of older people don't sleep the way younger people assume they do. They doze in short stretches, wake up at 2, wander down for water, sit in the common room watching whatever's playing on the muted television, then go back to bed around 4. Anyone who spent real time in elder care will tell you the overnight population is never as quiet as the schedule wants it to be. I bring this up because it's important to understand that residents being awake and out of their rooms at strange hours wasn't by itself unusual. I want that on the record before I describe what was unusual, because I think it's easy, looking back, to flatten the timeline and make every odd thing sound like part of one continuous mystery. It wasn't like that while I was living it. For most of my 2 years there, the job was exactly what you'd expect. Diaper changes, confused residents asking where their late husband was, and you gently reminding them the way you're trained to, rather than re-traumatizing them by making them relive the original loss every single night. Residents who buzzed the call button because they wanted company more than they wanted anything medical. A woman named Dot, who asked me to braid her hair at 1 a.m. because she said it helped her sleep. And I did it badly, and she laughed at me, and that was a good night. I want you to have those nights in your head too, not just the bad ones, because the bad ones only make sense against that backdrop. The resident at the center of all this was a man named Walter Greer. He'd been at the facility for about 4 years by the time I started, longer than almost anyone else on the floor. Long enough that some of the day staff treated him like furniture in the affectionate sense, the kind of resident everyone half forgets is still a full human being with a complete life behind him because he's become so woven into the daily routine. Walter was 83 when I met him. He'd had a stroke years earlier that left him with some mobility issues on his left side, used a cane most days and a wheelchair on bad ones. But his mind, by every account including my own 3 years of direct observation, was clear. Clearer than clear, honestly. Walter remembered staff birthdays. He remembered which of the day aides had a kid starting college and asked about it every single time she worked. He did the crossword in the Sunday paper in pen, which I always thought was either very confident or slightly insane, and he usually finished it. Walter had one habit that every single person who worked nights eventually learned about, usually within their first couple of weeks. The way you learn that the elevator on the east side sticks, or that the kitchen starts breakfast prep at 5 sharp, whether anyone's hungry yet or not. Almost every night, sometime between 1 and 3 in the morning, Walter would be awake in his room, or sometimes in the hallway, near the nurse's station, and he would ask whoever was nearby the same question. He'd ask if Nurse Tillman was working that night. The first time it happened to me, I didn't think anything of it. I was maybe my 2nd week on the floor, still learning everyone's names, still mixing up which resident needed thickened liquids and which one was on a regular diet, the kind of mistake that gets explained to you exactly once before you understand why it matters. I was doing a round, checking in on rooms, and Walter's door was open a crack with his bedside lamp on, which usually meant he wanted to talk. I poked my head in to ask if he needed anything, and he looked up from the book he wasn't really reading, more holding open across his lap while he stared at the wall, and he asked, "Is Tillman on tonight?" I said I didn't know a Tillman, that I was pretty new, and could he tell me anything more about her so I could check? He said, "Doesn't matter. She'll come around eventually. She always does." And that was it. He went back to his book, or his staring, and I finished my round and didn't think about it again until probably my 4th or 5th week, when I heard him ask the exact same question to a different aide, word for word close enough that it stuck with me. "Is Tillman on tonight?" I asked one of the senior aides about it during a break, mostly out of idle curiosity, the kind of question you ask because you have 40 minutes of downtime and not much else to fill it with. She told me Tillman used to be a nurse there, years back, before her time even. She said as far as she knew, the woman had passed away. She said it the way you'd mention any piece of facility trivia, the same tone she might use to tell me which ice machine was always broken. Then she changed the subject to something about the schedule for the following week, and I let it go, because at the time it really did seem like nothing. Old people repeat things. Old people, especially the ones with any cognitive decline at all, get attached to routines and questions and phrases and say them on a loop. sometimes for years, the way a song gets stuck in your head and just stays there. I'd already seen residents ask me the same 3 questions every single night without fail. Completely unaware they'd asked them the night before, sometimes unaware they'd asked them 5 minutes before. Walter asking about a dead nurse every so often seemed like exactly that. A loop, a groove, worn into a record. Nothing more. I want to be honest that for the better part of a year, that's exactly what I assumed it was. And I want to be honest that I was wrong about how simple it actually was, but I also don't want to pretend I spent that whole year suspicious or watchful. I didn't. I went to work. I did my job. I liked most of the residents, genuinely liked them. In the specific way you grow to like people you take care of in small physical ways. Helping someone to the bathroom at 2 a.m. builds an intimacy that's hard to explain to people who haven't done caregiving work. You stop being strangers fast. I liked Walter especially. He had a dry sense of humor, and he asked about my life in a way that felt like real interest rather than politeness, which is rarer than you'd think from people who've spent 80 plus years on Earth and could be forgiven for running out of curiosity about strangers half their age. It was only later, once other things started happening, that the Tillman question stopped feeling like background noise and started feeling like the first thread of something. But for a long stretch, it really was just one odd, repeated habit in a building full of odd, repeated habits. And if you told me back then that I'd spend years afterward turning that one sentence over in my head at 2 a.m, lying awake in my own bed long after I'd quit, I would have laughed and told you it wasn't that kind of place. I was wrong about that too. The first time the Tillman question actually snagged on something rather than just sliding past me the way it always had was during my second autumn at the facility, so close to a year and a half in. By then I knew the building the way you know your own house in the dark. Which door frame to avoid because it squeaks. Which hallway light buzzed faintly before it finally died for good. Which residents needed extra time with their words, and which ones needed you to just wait quietly while they worked something out in their own head. I'd settled into the job in the way you settle into any job that becomes less about the tasks and more about the rhythm of the people around you. We did paperwork constantly. I want to spend a minute on this because I think people who haven't worked in a facility like this imagine elder care as mostly hands-on physical work. And there's plenty of that, but there's an enormous undercurrent of documentation running beneath everything, every medication given, every meal eaten or refused, every fall, every change in behavior, every visit from a family member. All of it gets logged, both on paper charts that lived in a battered binder system left over from before the facility's last software update, and in an electronic system that half the staff, myself included, found clunky enough that we still defaulted to scribbling notes by hand and transcribing them into the computer at the end of the shift when we remembered. One of my duties, maybe twice a month, was helping pull old resident files for the front office during the day shift's business hours. Since night staff sometimes had downtime around 4 or 5 in the morning when nothing else needed doing, and the day administrator liked having things organized before she got in. This wasn't medical record pulling in the legally restricted sense. Mostly old activity logs, outdated emergency contact forms, that kind of administrative housekeeping that doesn't require a special clearance, just patience and the willingness to sit in a cold records room sorting through bankers' boxes. The records room was in the basement, down a flight of stairs, behind a door marked staff only that needed a code to open. It wasn't sinister so much as forgotten. Fluorescent tube lighting, half of it dead, concrete floor, The kind of space that always feels 10 degrees colder than the rest of the building regardless of the actual thermostat setting. Boxes lined the walls on metal shelving, labeled by year in handwriting from people who clearly hadn't expected anyone to ever need to read those labels again. I was down there on a slow Tuesday morning, somewhere around 4:30, pulling boxes from a particular year range the day administrator wanted reorganized, when I came across a manila folder that had slipped loose from its box and was sitting on the floor between two shelves, like it had been kicked there and forgotten. It wasn't part of what I was looking for, but I picked it up out of habit, the kind of reflexive tidying you do in a job where leaving things out of place gets noticed. The folder had a staff personnel tab on it, the kind used for former employee files rather than resident files, and the name on the tab was C. Tillman. I want to be honest that my first reaction wasn't alarm. It was mild curiosity, the kind you'd feel finding an old yearbook photo of someone you'd heard mentioned but never seen. I'd heard Walter's question often enough by then that the name had some weight to it, even if I still mostly considered it a quirk of his memory rather than anything worth investigating. I opened the folder, more out of nosiness than any real intention, and found what looked like a fairly standard personnel file. An employment application from years back, a photocopy of a nursing license, a couple of performance review forms, with handwritten notes from a supervisor whose signature I didn't recognize. The kind of mundane bureaucratic paper trail that exists behind every job anyone's ever had. There was a termination form near the back, the kind facilities use to document when and why an employee's file gets closed out. Most of it was filled in the way you'd expect. Name, position, department, hire date. The box for reason of separation had a single word checked off a short list of options. Deceased. The date on the form put her last day of employment a little over 11 years before I'd started working there. That matched what the senior aide had told me, more or less, so, if anything, it should have settled the question rather than opening a new one. Tillman had been a real nurse, had really worked there, had really died more than a decade ago. Walter's question made a strange kind of poetic sense if you squinted at it. An old man missing someone who used to care for him, someone who'd probably been kind to him during a long stay, someone whose death he might not have fully processed or perhaps simply forgot was final. The way dementia sometimes lets people relive grief on a loop without the relief of ever reaching acceptance. It was sad. It wasn't sinister. I remember actually feeling a kind of tenderness toward Walter, standing there in that cold basement thinking I finally understood the shape of his nightly question, and feeling a little ashamed that it had taken me this long to think of it as something other than an odd habit. I might have left it entirely there. Might never have thought about it again beyond that one moment of basement sympathy, except that the date on the termination form bothered me later that same week in a way I couldn't quite place at first. Before I get to that, though, I think it's worth describing what an ordinary night actually looked like during that first year and a half, because I don't think the rest of this makes sense without that texture sitting underneath it. The break room was a windowless rectangle behind the kitchen, 2 vending machines that took turns being broken, a refrigerator with everyone's name taped to their own shelf in a system nobody fully respected, and a television mounted in the corner that only ever seemed to get a handful of channels clearly. We ate in shifts, staggered so the floor was never fully unstaffed 15 or 20 minutes at a stretch, sometimes less if someone's call light went off mid-bite. Most of what got discussed in that room had nothing to do with anything strange. It was the ordinary gossip of any workplace: who was picking up extra shifts and who was avoiding them, whose kid had a recital coming up, complaints about the new scheduling software, speculation about whether the facility would finally replace the ancient microwave that scorched everything on the inside edge of the turntable. Renata held court there more often than not, in the sense that conversations tended to orbit her without her ever needing to seek that out, partly because of her seniority, and partly because she had a way of making even mundane updates sound like something worth hearing. There was an unspoken hierarchy to who got taken seriously when they reported something odd. New hires like Priya, when she first started, got a kind of indulgent skepticism, the assumption that anything strange they noticed was more likely inexperience than anything actually wrong. Residents do unpredictable things, and a 6-week employee hasn't built up the pattern recognition yet to know which unpredictable things are routine. Long-tenured staff, like Renata and Hector, got taken at their word almost automatically, the assumption being that anyone who'd survived that many years on overnights had already filtered out their own overreactions long ago. I existed somewhere in the middle by the time any of this started, 18 months in, trusted enough to be left alone with the floor, but still young enough in tenure that I mostly kept my head down, rather than holding forth on much of anything, which is part of why, I think, it took me as long as it did to bring the Tillman question to anyone directly. It wasn't my place yet in the unspoken social order of that break room to be the one raising unsettling questions about the facility's own history. That kind of thing was Renata's territory, or Hector's. People whose standing gave them the right to ask without it looking like overreach. I bring all this up because I want to be honest that my hesitation to dig further in those early months wasn't purely a matter of believing it was nothing. Some of it was simply workplace politics, the kind of quiet self-censorship everyone learns in any job with an informal seniority structure. I didn't want to be the new guy, stirring up old ghosts, literally or otherwise, before I'd put in enough time to have earned the standing to do so without it looking strange. That changed slowly. The way most things at that job changed slowly, through repetition rather than any single dramatic event. By the time I'd been there a year, I'd absorbed enough of the building's rhythms that asking questions about its history didn't feel like overreach anymore. It felt like ordinary curiosity from someone who'd put in his time. And it was around then that the date on the termination form started bothering me in earnest. It was the math. I did the arithmetic without really meaning to, the way your brain sometimes keeps chewing on a number long after you've moved on to something else. 11 years before I started would put Tillman's death several years before Walter had even moved into the facility. I knew Walter's intake date because residents' move-in dates came up constantly in casual conversation among staff, used as a kind of shorthand for how long someone had been part of the place, the same way people reference how long they've lived in a city. Walter had moved in roughly 7 years before I started. Tillman had died around 4 years before Walter ever arrived, which meant, as far as the paperwork could tell me, Walter, Greer, and Nurse Tillman had never actually overlapped. He'd never have been her patient. He'd never have met her at all, not in any way the facility's own records could account for. I sat on that fact for a few days without doing anything about it, mostly because I genuinely wasn't sure it meant anything. Memory does strange things to elderly residents, and it's not unusual at all for someone with even mild cognitive decline to merge two separate people into one, or to absorb a story they were told about a place into their own sense of personal history until it feels like a memory of something they witnessed firsthand. I'd seen residents insist they used to work at the facility themselves, decades before it existed in its current form. I'd seen residents describe events from movies as things that had happened to them. The brain, especially an aging one, is not a reliable archivist. It edits, it splices, it fills gaps with whatever's lying around. So I told myself that was almost certainly what was happening with Walter. He'd heard about Tillman from someone, another resident maybe, or staff talk he'd overheard during his early years there. And somewhere along the way his mind had quietly inserted her into his own personal timeline, made her his nurse instead of someone else's. It happens. It's sad, but it's ordinary sad. The unglamorous kind of sad that fills nursing homes everywhere and rarely makes for a story anyone wants to hear, which is probably part of why I didn't think much more about it. What changed things wasn't Walter at all, at least not directly. It was Renata. Renata Cruz had worked at the facility longer than almost anyone on staff, day or night, somewhere north of 15 years by the time I got there, most of it on overnights by choice. She told me once that she preferred nights because the building felt more honest after midnight. No families dropping by trying to perform cheerfulness for their parents. No administrators wandering the halls in their good shoes. Just the residents and the people actually doing the work. I liked her enormously. She trained me during my first month. And even after I was off orientation, she kept half an eye on me the way a senior coworker does when they've decided, usually without saying so, that you're worth the trouble of looking out for. Renata had known Walter the entire time he'd lived there. She'd been on staff for years before he even moved in, and she remembered details about his arrival that frankly impressed me, since I struggled to remember what I'd eaten for dinner the night before some shifts. She remembered that Walter's daughter had handled his intake paperwork because his wife had passed only a few months earlier, that he'd been quiet and withdrawn his first several weeks, that he'd slowly come out of his shell once he started doing the activity room's chess nights with a now deceased resident named Frank. I brought up Tillman to her almost as a throwaway comment one slow night somewhere around 2 a.m. while we were both restocking a supply cart in the hallway outside the nurses' station. I mentioned the personnel file I'd found, mentioned the dates not lining up, mostly because I thought it was a mildly interesting bit of facility trivia, the kind of thing you bring up to fill silence during a repetitive task. Renata went quiet in a way that made me look up from the cart. She told me she remembered Tillman, not as a name on a form, as a person. She said Tillman had worked the overnight shift herself, years back before Renata moved permanently to nights. When Renata was still splitting her time between day and evening shifts, trying to figure out which schedule suited her, she said Tillman had been well liked, good with the harder residents, the ones who fought medication or got agitated during sundowning. She said when Tillman died, it had hit the staff hard, because she died suddenly. An aneurysm, no warning at all, here, 1 week and gone the next. I asked her when that had happened, expecting her to confirm the date on the personnel form. She thought about it for a long moment, counting something on her fingers, the way people do when they're trying to anchor a memory to other memories they're more confident about. And then she said the math didn't work the way I'd described it. She said Tillman had still been working there when Walter moved in. She remembered it specifically because she remembered Tillman being one of the staff members assigned to help Walter adjust during his first difficult weeks. The quiet, withdrawn period right after his wife's death I mentioned a moment ago. She remembered Tillman sitting with him during meals when he wouldn't eat otherwise. She remembered it clearly enough that she described the exact dining chair Tillman used to pull up next to his. Said it had a wobbly leg that nobody ever fixed. I told her the personnel file had a termination date that put Tillman's death years before Walter's intake. Renata frowned at that, said paperwork gets entered wrong all the time. Dates get transposed, and besides, who knows how long that file sat around before someone actually filled out the back half of it. She didn't seem alarmed. She seemed mildly annoyed. The way you get annoyed at any small contradiction in something you're confident about. The same energy as being told a fact you know to be true is technically incorrect according to some outdated reference. I let it drop that night. But over the following weeks, I found myself bringing it up to other long-tenured staff, partly out of genuine curiosity now, partly because once you notice something doesn't add up, your brain has a hard time leaving it alone, the way you can't stop running your tongue over a chipped tooth, even when you know it'll hurt a little every time. What I got back wasn't agreement. It was contradiction stacked on contradiction. One of the day shift LPNs, a woman named Bridget, who'd been there almost as long as Renata, told me she remembered Tillman as someone who'd left the facility under a cloud and not died there at all. Said there'd been some kind of complaint or investigation that ended with her resigning quietly, and that the dying suddenly story was something people told later to be polite. The way workplaces sometimes soften an ugly departure into a sadder, simpler story that nobody has to feel conflicted about repeating. When I asked her what the complaint had been about, she said she genuinely didn't remember. Said it was a long time ago and she'd only heard about it secondhand from someone who'd since retired herself. A maintenance worker named Hector, who'd been doing facilities upkeep there even longer than either of them, told me a third version entirely. He said Tillman had transferred to a different branch of the company, some sister facility 2 counties over, and that as far as he knew she might still be alive somewhere, working or retired. He had no idea, but he was certain she hadn't died on the property. Certain enough that he seemed almost offended by the suggestion, like I was spreading a rumor about someone he respected. I want to slow down here, because I think it's important to understand how unsettling this actually felt in the moment, as opposed to how it might read now, compressed into a few paragraphs. These weren't 3 random strangers giving me wild stories. These were people I worked beside several nights a week. People whose judgment I trusted enough to hand them a fall-risk resident transfer without double-checking their form. People who remembered which residents needed extra blankets without being told. And each of them spoke about Tillman with total, unhesitating confidence. Not one of them said, "I think," or "if I remember right." They each delivered their version the way you'd state your own birthday. Renata was sure Tillman died suddenly while Walter was already living there. Bridget was sure she'd left under some unspecified disgrace years before that. Hector was sure she'd simply transferred away and was, as far as anyone knew, still out there somewhere, alive, doing whatever retired nurses do with their time. 3 confident, contradictory certainties, and a personnel file in a basement that agreed with none of them. I didn't know what to do with that, so for a while, I did nothing at all. I kept working. I kept checking in on Walter during my rounds, and when he asked his question, which he still did, several nights a week, sometimes skipping a stretch of 4 or 5 days only to ask it twice in one night. When he did resurface, I started answering differently than I had before. I stopped saying I didn't know who he meant. I started saying I wasn't sure if she was on tonight, which felt like a strange thing to be telling an elderly man about a woman who'd been dead for over a decade, by every account, even the inconsistent ones. But it seemed to settle him better than any flat denial ever had. He'd nod, satisfied, and go back to whatever he'd been doing before I came by. I told myself this was just good caregiving practice, You don't argue with dementia. You redirect, gently. You don't insist a confused resident's late spouse is dead if reminding them serves no purpose except causing fresh grief over an old wound. I'd been taught that explicitly in my CNA training, validation over correction, and especially for residents whose memory loss made repeated grief genuinely cruel rather than merely awkward. Walter wasn't even diagnosed with dementia, as far as I knew from his chart, which made my own behavior a little harder to justify using that logic, but it felt like the kind thing to do regardless, so I kept doing it. What I didn't tell myself, not yet, was that some small, persistent part of me had started listening a little more carefully every time I walked past the nurse's station after midnight. The way you listen differently in a house after someone's told you they think they heard something the night before, and I didn't believe anything was actually there. I want to be clear about that. I was, by every measure I could have given you at the time, a rational 27-year-old man with a job to do and a healthy skepticism about ghost stories. But something about the shape of those three contradictory accounts had lodged itself in the back of my mind the way a song lyric does when you've misheard it your whole life and someone finally points out the real words and you can't unhear the correct version no matter how hard you try to go back to the comfortable wrong one. The building didn't feel different yet. I want to be honest about that too. It would eventually, but that came later and slower than I think anyone watching from the outside would expect. Winter came on hard that year, the kind of cold that makes an old building's bones complain in ways you don't notice during milder months. The facility was original construction from the late 70s with a couple of additions bolted on in the 90s. And like a lot of buildings of that vintage, it had an HVAC system that worked but never let you forget it was working. There was a particular stretch of hallway outside the old physical therapy room, mostly unused since the facility built a newer therapy gym closer to Magnolia Wing, where the heating vent made a low groaning sound every time the system cycled. A sound I'd grown so used to over a year and a half that I genuinely stopped hearing it most nights. The way you stop hearing your own refrigerator hum. That winter, the groaning got worse, longer, and started happening at irregular intervals that didn't match the thermostat cycle the way it always had before. I mentioned it to facilities during a shift handoff, mostly as a heads up rather than a complaint. And Hector came out one afternoon to look at it. He told me the ductwork in that section ran behind an old supply closet that had been sealed off years before he started, something to do with asbestos abatement on the original insulation, and that whatever was happening back there. He couldn't fully diagnose it without opening a wall he wasn't authorized to open without a work order from corporate, which apparently took months to get approved for anything that wasn't an active safety hazard. So the groaning stayed. It became one more piece of ambient noise in a building already full of ambient noise, joining the squeak of supply cart wheels that housekeeping never oiled, the hum of the ice machine on Magnolia, the distant beep of call buttons being pressed and silenced. I want to stress this because the temptation telling a story like this is to make every strange sound feel like a clue. Most of them weren't. Most of them were just an old building being an old building. And I lived inside that ordinary decay for 2 years without once thinking it meant anything beyond a maintenance backlog and a stingy capital improvements budget. The first night, something actually unsettled me, rather than just registering as odd, happened in early December, on a night that started unremarkably enough that I can still walk through almost the entire shift from memory, hour by hour, the way you can recall the layout of a familiar room with your eyes closed. I was working with a newer aide that night, a young woman named Priya, who'd only been on staff about 6 weeks, still nervous about handling falls, and still asking me to double-check her medication pass, even though she didn't technically need a second set of eyes for most of it. Around 1:30, she went to take her break, and I did a solo round through Sunrise Wing while she was off the floor, which was normal practice when staffing allowed it. One person doing checks while the other ate or used the bathroom or just sat somewhere quiet for 15 minutes to keep from losing their mind from the monotony. I went past Walter's room first, like always, more out of habit than expectation, since it wasn't unusual for his door to be closed and dark by that hour on plenty of nights. That night it was open, light on, same as it had been the very first time he'd asked me about Tillman all those months before. I leaned in to check on him and found him sitting up in bed, awake, alert, looking toward his closed closet door rather than toward me, even though he must have heard me come in. I asked if he was all right, and he said yes, perfectly calm. And then he asked his usual question. Was Tillman working that night? I gave him my usual non-answer, said I wasn't sure, and he nodded the way he always did and seemed satisfied. I was about to step back out and continue my round when he added something he'd never said before in all the months I'd been hearing the question. He said, "Tell her I'm sorry about the chair. I never got around to fixing it." I didn't know what to say to that. I asked him what chair he meant, genuinely curious now rather than just performing routine reassurance, and he looked at me like the question was strange, like I should already know, and said, "The one with the wobbly leg in the dining room. She always sat in it with me, and it used to lean, and I kept saying I'd ask Hector to fix it, and I never did. I want you to sit with that detail the way I had to sit with it alone, in a quiet hallway, at nearly 2 in the morning." I had never told Walter what Renata told me. I had never mentioned the wobbly-legged dining chair to him or to anyone on staff besides Renata herself. And as far as I knew, Renata hadn't either, since she and Walter rarely overlapped, her being permanent overnight and him generally being asleep, or at least in his room by the time her shift even started most nights. There was no ordinary channel by which Walter could have heard that specific, oddly particular detail about a chair from anyone, let alone repeated it back to me unprompted, using almost the exact same words Renata had used describing it. I told myself, standing in that hallway, that this was almost certainly coincidence, or some explanation I simply hadn't thought of yet. Maybe Walter had mentioned the chair to Renata himself years earlier, and she'd absorbed the detail from him rather than from any memory of Tillman. And her own mind had simply reorganized the story to make Tillman the one who told it. The same kind of memory drift I'd already decided was probably happening to Walter himself. Memory is a circle that 2 people can walk in either direction and arrive at the same point having traveled different roads. That's the kind of phrase I actually said to myself, standing in that hallway, trying to argue my own unease back down to a manageable size. It mostly worked that night. I finished my round, found nothing else out of place, and when Priya came back from her break, I didn't mention any of it to her. Partly because she was new and skittish enough about the job already, without me adding ghost stories to her orientation. Denti, and partly because saying it out loud to someone else felt like it would make the thing more real than I wanted it to be at 2 in the morning with 5 more hours left on shift. But I noticed walking back past the old sealed-off supply closet near the unused physical therapy room a little later that same night that the groaning sound from the vents had stopped completely, not cycled down the way it usually did between heating cycles. stopped the way a sound stops when whatever's making it has finished, or when whatever's making it has gone still to listen to something else. I stood there for longer than I want to admit, just listening to nothing, before I made myself keep moving. I went looking for the Tillman personnel file again about 2 weeks after that night, mostly because I wanted to read it more carefully than I had the first time, when I'd been more curious than careful, flipping through pages in a cold basement without really absorbing what I was looking at. I wanted to see if there was an old address, an emergency contact, anything that might let me independently verify some piece of her story, rather than relying on the increasingly unreliable memories of people who'd actually worked alongside her. The folder wasn't where I'd left it. I want to be precise about this rather than dramatic. I hadn't memorized the exact box and shelf, but I had a reasonably good idea since the box it had originally fallen out of was clearly marked with a year range. And I'd put the folder back into that same box before I left the records room that first night. The kind of small tidiness that becomes automatic after enough time spent being trained not to leave things out of place in a facility full of liability concerns. I went through that box. I went through the boxes on either side of it in case I'd misremembered which one. I went through the entire shelf, then the shelf below it, growing more methodical and less casual with each pass, the way looking for something shifts from a leisurely search into something closer to an investigation once you've failed enough times in a row. The folder was not in the records room, not that day, and not on 2 subsequent occasions over the following month when I had reason to be down there again and used the opportunity to look once more, telling myself each time that I was probably just bad at this particular kind of searching, that institutional records get mislabeled and misplaced constantly in any large organization, that this meant nothing more sinister than someone from the front office having pulled it for some unrelated administrative reason and not yet returned it. I asked about it eventually, carefully, framing the question as a logistics issue rather than anything personal. I asked the day administrator, a woman named Carol Anning, who'd run the front office for almost a decade, whether former employee personnel files ever got pulled for any reason, audits, legal requests, that kind of thing, and whether there'd be a sign-out log I could check to find where the Tillman file had gone. Carol's reaction was the first moment in this entire story where I felt something shift from merely strange into something with actual weight behind it. She didn't answer the question. Not really. She asked me why I was looking for that particular file, in a tone that wasn't hostile exactly, but was noticeably more clipped than her usual brisk but friendly office manner. I gave her some version of the truth, said I'd come across it doing the box reorganization, said a resident kept mentioning the name and I'd gotten curious about the timeline. I tried to make it sound as boring as possible, the kind of idle curiosity nobody should feel the need to manage. Carol told me that file shouldn't have been in general circulation at all, that personnel records for former employees, especially ones involving any kind of sensitive separation, were supposed to be kept in a locked cabinet in her office rather than the open shelving in the basement, and that she'd look into how it had ended up where I found it. She thanked me for bringing it to her attention in a way that very clearly meant the conversation was over. And then she asked me, almost as an afterthought on my way out the door, not to mention the file or its contents to other staff, said something vague about employee privacy even for deceased former employees. Said the company took that kind of thing seriously given past litigation in the industry around exactly this sort of confidentiality. I said sure, of course, and left her office feeling like I'd just been handled rather than answered. What struck me most, walking away from that conversation, wasn't the request for discretion itself, which on its own would have seemed perfectly reasonable, even admirable, the kind of professional boundary you'd expect from someone running an office that dealt with vulnerable people's private information every day. What struck me was the phrase sensitive separation, which Carol used once and then visibly seemed to regret using, the way people sometimes let slip a piece of internal vocabulary that they didn't mean to share with someone outside whatever conversations that vocabulary usually lives inside. It implied a category. It implied that somewhere in the building's institutional memory, even if not in mine, Tillman's departure had a designation more complicated than the single, tidy word deceased that I'd seen checked off on the termination form. I didn't bring it up again with Carol after that, but I noticed over the following weeks that whenever Tillman's name came up around certain staff, even glancingly, even as a kind of dark joke, the way overnight staff sometimes joke about anything uncomfortable to make it bearable, there was a small but consistent flinch in how people handled it. Bridget, the LPN who'd told me the resignation under a cloud version, stopped engaging with the topic entirely after that, would change the subject with a speed that felt almost rehearsed whenever I tried to bring it up again, like she'd been told something in the interim that made her want distance from the conversation rather than closer involvement in it. Hector, normally happy to talk my ear off about almost anything during slow maintenance calls, got noticeably shorter with me, started keeping our interactions strictly professional in a way that felt like a closed door rather than simple disinterest. Renata was the only one who didn't pull back. If anything, she leaned in further, which in hindsight should probably have worried me more than the avoidance from everyone else did, since consistency from one source surrounded by retreat from every other source is its own kind of red flag, a single data point standing very alone in an empty field. She told me a few weeks into this stretch that she started having trouble sleeping during the day, said she kept thinking about Tillman without meaning to, kept replaying small memories she hadn't thought about in years. The specific cadence of the woman's laugh, a habit she'd had of humming while she did medication passes, the brand of hand lotion she always used that left a particular smell in any room she'd spent time in. I asked Renata, gently, whether all this thinking about Tillman was upsetting her, whether she wanted to talk to someone about it, the kind of question you ask a coworker you genuinely care about when you notice them dwelling somewhere that doesn't seem to be doing them any good. She told me it wasn't upsetting exactly. She said it felt more like a debt she hadn't realized she still owed, like she'd let something go unfinished, and her own mind had decided, all on its own, and without asking her permission, that now was finally the time to finish it. I didn't know what to do with that sentence either. I still don't fully, but I remember walking away from that conversation with a feeling I hadn't had since I was a kid, afraid of the dark in my childhood bedroom. The specific feeling of being watched by something that wasn't actually visible. The conviction arriving well ahead of any evidence that could justify it. The building still looked the same. The hallways were still beige, the handrails still scuffed at the same height from years of frail hands gripping them. The dining room still smelled like the same reheated vegetables it always had. Nothing had changed in any way I could have photographed or pointed to. But something underneath all of it had started to feel different. The way a familiar piece of music sounds wrong the instant a single note in it goes flat, even if you can't immediately identify which note it was. I started noticing the sealed-off supply closet near the old physical therapy room more than I ever had before, which is its own kind of strange admission, since for the better part of 2 years it had been exactly the sort of architectural dead space you walk past hundreds of times without your brain bothering to register it at all. It was just a door. Industrial gray, no window, a hand-lettered sign taped to it years ago that read, "Do not enter asbestos abatement." The tape gone yellow and curling at the corners. Hector had told me that one afternoon he'd come to look at the ductwork, that the closet had been sealed sometime in the early 2000s, well before his own tenure, as part of a remediation project that apparently never got finished. The closet simply boarded off rather than properly cleared, a half measure that became permanent the way half measures so often do in underfunded institutions. I started slowing down when I passed it, not stopping, not at first, just an almost involuntary deceleration, the kind of thing your body does before your conscious mind has caught up to deciding it wants to. The first time I heard something that I can't entirely explain away, even now, even with every ordinary possibility I've tried to talk myself into since, was on a night in January, bitterly cold outside. The kind of cold that makes the whole building tick and settle audibly as the temperature differential works on old materials. I was doing my 3 a.m. round, alone again. Priya having graduated by then from new hire to someone trusted enough to handle the medication cart solo while I covered the hallway checks. And as I came around the corner near the unused therapy room, I heard what sounded like two people talking, low, conversational, the specific cadence of an ordinary back and forth rather than anything urgent or distressed. It was coming from behind the sealed closet door. I stood there and listened for what felt like a long time, but was probably closer to 10 or 15 seconds, trying to parse actual words out of the sound and failing. The way you can sometimes hear a conversation through a wall clearly enough to know it's a conversation and not clearly enough to know what it's about. One voice seemed lower, the other higher. Though I want to be honest that this is the kind of detail memory likes to sharpen after the fact, and I genuinely don't know how much of what I remember hearing is what I actually heard in that hallway versus what my mind has since polished into a tidier, more convincing version of the story. And I did what I think most people would do, which is nothing dramatic. I didn't fling the door open. I didn't run. I stood there, registered that the sound was strange, registered that there was no earthly reason for two voices to be coming from a sealed asbestos closet at 3 a.m. And then I kept walking, because I had 4 more rooms to check before I could justify going back to investigate something that, by the time I reached the end of the hallway, I had already mostly convinced myself I'd misheard. Old HVAC systems can produce sounds that mimic speech with disturbing fidelity if the ductwork resonates a certain way. I'd read that somewhere once, in some completely unrelated context, and it became my explanation of choice for that night, repeated to myself enough times on the walk back to the nurse's station that I almost believed it by the time I sat down. I told Priya about it the next night, framing it carefully as a funny story about old buildings making weird noises rather than anything I actually believed was paranormal, because by daylight, or by the fluorescent equivalent of daylight we worked under, that's genuinely how it felt in retrospect. An amusing anecdote rather than a real fear. She laughed and said the building gave her the creeps sometimes too. Said she'd heard a baby crying once in Heritage Wing, the locked memory care unit, at an hour when there shouldn't have been any infants anywhere on the property, and that she'd asked a Heritage staff member about it who told her, totally unbothered, that residents sometimes made sounds like that during night terrors, an explanation that satisfied her completely at the time, but that she admitted telling me about it now sounded thinner the more she thought about it. A few weeks after that, I had a conversation with Dot, the same resident I mentioned earlier. the one who used to ask me to braid her hair badly at 1 a.m. Dot was 91, sharp some nights and foggy on others in a way that came and went without much pattern I could ever predict. And she'd lived at the facility nearly as long as Walter had, though on a different hallway, close enough that their paths crossed occasionally in the common areas, but not so often that I'd ever thought of them as particularly close. I asked her, mostly out of habit by then, whether she remembered a nurse named Tillman. I'd started asking almost everyone who seemed lucid enough to engage with the question, a kind of informal survey. I never planned out so much as fell into, the way you keep pulling a thread once you've noticed it's loose. Dot's face did something I hadn't seen from any of the other residents I'd asked. She didn't look puzzled or thoughtful the way most people do when reaching for an old memory. She looked briefly, unmistakably frightened. The kind of fear that flashes and is gone before the person experiencing it has had time to decide whether to show it to you. Then she composed herself and told me, in a voice that had gone noticeably quieter than her usual register, that she didn't like to talk about that and said it wasn't her business and never had been, said some things were better left where they were. I asked her as gently as I knew how what she meant by that, what specifically wasn't her business. She told me that during her early years at the facility, long before I'd started, there'd been a stretch of time when staff weren't supposed to discuss a particular nurse at all, that the instruction had come down clearly enough that even the residents had picked up on it. The way residents always pick up on the moods and unspoken rules of a place, even when nobody explains them directly. She said she didn't know the reason behind the instruction, only that it had been firm, and that breaking it, even now, this many years later, made her uneasy in a way she couldn't fully justify with anything as solid as an actual memory of consequences. I told her she wasn't in any trouble, that I was just curious, that this was ancient history at this point, and surely whatever rule that had been didn't apply anymore. She looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that made me feel briefly like the much younger and far less informed person in the room, despite my badge and my job title. And she said something I wrote down in my notebook that same night, because I didn't want to risk losing the exact wording. She said, "Rules like that don't expire just because everyone forgot why they were made." I didn't push her further. I didn't want to be the reason a 91-year-old woman lost sleep over something that had clearly unsettled her decades ago, and apparently still could. But I left that conversation with a feeling that had started becoming familiar by then. The sense that I'd knocked on one more door in a long hallway of doors, and that whatever was behind each of them, nobody currently alive in that building had the full picture. Only fragments, distributed unevenly, guarded according to rules, whose original purpose had long since evaporated, leaving only the guarding behind. I want to mention Frank Delgado here because his role in all this is small, but I think important. Frank was a resident in Sunrise 2 doors down from Walter, sharper some days than others, but generally well-oriented, a retired postal worker who liked to tell long stories about routes he used to walk decades ago, stories I'd heard enough times that I could probably recite portions of them myself. I didn't think Frank knew Walter especially well, beyond the basic familiarity of 2 men who'd lived on the same hallway for years and occasionally crossed paths in the common room. One night, completely unprompted, while I was helping Frank back to bed after a bathroom trip, he mentioned that Walter had been talking to himself again. I asked what he meant, and Frank said he could hear Walter through the shared wall some nights, having what sounded like a full conversation, 2 distinct sides of it. Though Frank admitted he could never make out words clearly enough to know what was actually being discussed. He said it didn't bother him particularly, said plenty of folks talk to themselves at their age, himself included some nights. But he mentioned almost as an aside that he sometimes heard a woman's voice in there too, distinct from Walter's, and that he'd always assumed it was a television or a radio until one night he realized Walter didn't own either. I asked Frank if he'd ever mentioned this to staff. He said he had once, ages ago, to a day nurse whose name he couldn't remember, and that she told him not to worry about it. Said it was being handled in a tone he described as oddly final, like the subject was already closed before he'd even finished raising it. I didn't sleep well after that conversation with Frank, not because of any one detail in it, which on their own were each explainable. Residents do talk to themselves. Walls in old buildings carry sound in unpredictable ways. Day staff give vague reassurances about all kinds of minor concerns, just to keep the floor moving smoothly. It was the accumulation that got to me, each piece small. The total weight of it not small at all. I started somewhere around that point, keeping a private list. Not anything formal, just a page in the back of a notebook I used for shift notes, where I jotted down dates and small details whenever something about the Tillman situation struck me as worth remembering. I'm not sure what I thought I was building toward. I don't think I had a clear goal in mind beyond simply not trusting my own memory to hold all of it accurately on its own. The way you write down a dream the moment you wake up because you already feel it dissolving. Looking back at that notebook now, years later, the handwriting gets visibly worse the further into it I go. Smaller and more cramped, like I was writing faster or later or with hands that weren't entirely steady. I want to talk about what I did next, because I think it's the point in the story where I stopped being a passive observer of something strange happening around me and started actively trying to understand it, which in hindsight might have been the worst choice, though I don't know that I could have stopped myself, even if I'd recognized that at the time. Curiosity, once it's properly hooked into you, doesn't care much about your own well-being. I asked around about the phrase Carol had let slip, sensitive separation, mostly among staff old enough to have worked there during whatever period Tillman's employment had actually ended. However many years prior that genuinely was. Most people gave me nothing, either because they truly didn't know, or because they'd already decided, the way Bridget and Hector clearly had, that this was a topic better left alone. But I eventually got a partial answer from someone I hadn't expected to be useful at all. A part-time weekend cook named Esther, who'd worked in the kitchen for almost 20 years and who I'd always thought of as someone entirely outside the orbit of clinical staff drama, since kitchen staff rarely interacted much with the nursing side beyond meal service logistics. Esther told me during a quiet stretch one Saturday night, when I'd come down to grab a late tray for a resident who'd missed dinner, that she remembered when Tillman left. And that the story among kitchen staff at the time, which she stressed was just talk, nothing she could vouch for as fact, was that there'd been some kind of incident involving a resident's death that Tillman had been blamed for, not criminally. Nothing that ever involved police, as far as she knew, but enough that the facility wanted her gone quietly, rather than dealing with a wrongful death claim or a state inspection that might come digging if the story got messier than it needed to be. I asked which resident. Esther said she didn't remember a name, said it was a long time ago, said the story going around at the time was that the resident had been given the wrong medication or the wrong dose, something along those lines, and had passed away as a result, and that the facility's official position then and apparently ever since was that the resident's death was unrelated, a natural decline that simply happened to occur during the same general period, nothing more than unfortunate timing. She said Tillman had resigned before any formal action was taken against her license, which under that version of events would explain why nothing about a state board investigation or revoked license ever surfaced in the personnel file I'd seen, since a quiet resignation lets a facility avoid reporting requirements that a formal termination for cause might trigger. And then Esther said something that I've turned over in my head more than almost anything else anyone told me during this whole period. She said that a few months after Tillman left, under whatever circumstances she actually left under, word went around the kitchen and the floor staff that Tillman had died. Esther said she never learned exactly how, never saw an obituary, never heard a cause given beyond vague references to it being sudden, and that at the time she remembered finding it strange that nobody from the facility seemed to want to discuss the details. Strange enough that she'd specifically remembered finding it strange. 20 years on, which told me it had genuinely bothered her even then. Not just in retrospect once I came along asking questions that gave old discomfort a new reason to surface. I asked Esther if she thought the facility might have had something to do with how vaguely Tillman's death got communicated. She got noticeably uncomfortable at that, said she didn't think anyone did anything to that woman, said she didn't want to imply that, said places like this just don't like talking about death in general, employee or resident, because death is bad for the brand, bad for the families touring with their hesitant elderly parents in tow, trying to decide if this was where they wanted to spend their remaining years. She said it was probably nothing more sinister than ordinary corporate squeamishness. The same impulse that kept administration from ever using the word died over the intercom when a resident passed during a shift, opting instead for vaguer language about a resident having transitioned, language designed to keep grief at arm's length from the institution's daily operations. That explanation made sense. It still makes sense, actually, even now writing this. Institutions protect themselves from anything that smells like liability. Almost reflexively, the same way a person flinches before they've consciously registered the thing they're flinching from. I don't think Carol Anning or anyone above her that I ever interacted with was hiding some elaborate, deliberate secret in the sense of a conspiracy with a clear shape and clear actors. I think it's more likely that over years, the facility's instinct to avoid the subject simply hardened into a kind of institutional silence that nobody actively maintained anymore because nobody needed to. The silence had become self-sustaining. Nobody talked about it because nobody talked about it, the same way certain words become unsayable in a family, not because of any single dramatic event, but because of the accumulated weight of years spent carefully not saying them. What I couldn't explain, no matter how many ordinary, boring, institutional reasons I lined up against it, was Walter. Walter wasn't part of any of this silence. He hadn't worked there. He had no professional reputation at stake, no liability concern, no corporate instinct towards self-protection. He was just an old man in a bed who, by the facility's own records, should never have crossed paths with this woman at all, and who, nonetheless, asked about her almost every single night with the casual, unbothered consistency of someone checking whether a friend's shift happened to line up with his own. I brought all of this, eventually carefully, back to Carol. Not because I thought she'd suddenly open up after our first conversation, but because by that point I genuinely wanted to know if she'd ever heard the resident death version of the story Esther had described. If there was any truth buried in there that the personnel file's tidy single word deceased was quietly papering over. Carol's response was the most direct anyone had been with me through this entire stretch, and it didn't sit well. Not in the moment and not for a long time afterward. She told me in a closed-door conversation in her office that I remember almost word for word because of how carefully I think she chose each sentence, that there were things about long-tenured staff and long-tenured residents that accumulate complicated histories over the years. Histories that aren't anyone's business to go digging through, especially not a night care associate, without the standing or the need to know. She said she appreciated that I cared about the residents. Said that came through clearly in my work, and she didn't want to discourage it, but she said I needed to understand that some questions, however innocently asked, could create real legal and reputational exposure for a facility that depended entirely on trust from families who had no choice but to leave their loved ones in the hands of strangers every single day. She said the word liability more than once, in a tone that made clear she meant it as something close to a warning rather than an explanation. And then she said something I've never been able to fully shake. She said, "Whatever Walter thinks he remembers, it isn't your job to confirm or deny it. It's your job to keep him comfortable. That's all any of us can do for him at this point." At this point. I didn't ask what she meant by that phrase. I wish, looking back, that I had. But something in her tone made clear the conversation was finished, whether I had follow-up questions or not. And I left her office that day with the distinct, uncomfortable sense that I had just been told, as gently and professionally as institutional language allows, to stop looking. I spent a long time afterward trying to decide whether Carol herself actually knew more than she was telling me, or whether she was simply doing what administrators in institutions like that one learn to do instinctively, managing a vague, inherited unease without ever needing to understand its specific origin. I've worked enough jobs since then, in enough ordinary offices with their own inherited, half-explained policies, to know that organizations are very good at preserving caution long after they've lost the memory of what originally caused it. Somebody at some point, possibly years before Carol herself ever took the job, had decided that conversations about Tillman carried risk. That decision had calcified into policy. The policy had calcified into instinct. And the instinct now expressed itself through Carol without her necessarily having access to whatever original event had justified it in the first place. I don't think she was lying to me exactly when she spoke in vague terms about liability and complicated histories. I think it's entirely possible that vagueness was all she actually had left to work with, the specifics having been quietly buried by however many years and however many staff turnovers stood between her and whatever the original sensitive separation had actually involved. That didn't make the conversation feel any less like a closed door. Institutions don't need a villain twirling a mustache somewhere in a back office to keep a secret. Sometimes all it takes is enough ordinary people, each one only knowing a fragment, each one individually deciding that their fragment isn't worth the trouble of raising, for an entire shape to stay hidden in plain sight for years. Nobody has to be lying for that to work. Everybody just has to keep doing what felt like the smaller, safer thing in the moment over and over, until the accumulated weight of all those small, safe choices becomes its own kind of wall. I didn't stop, but I got quieter about it, which in some ways made everything that came afterward feel even lonelier than it otherwise might have. I stopped bringing Tillman up with most of the staff after that conversation with Carol, partly out of genuine caution about my own job security, and partly because I'd started to realize that almost everyone I might have talked to had already either shut the door on the subject themselves or didn't have anything left to tell me that I hadn't already heard in one contradictory form or another. The exception, as it had been from early on, was Renata. And over the following weeks, she became less a source of information and more, I think, a person I was quietly worried about. She started staying later after her shifts ended, sometimes by 20 minutes, sometimes by closer to an hour, telling the day staff coming on that she just wanted to finish up some charting, which wasn't implausible on its own. Charting always ran behind, but it became frequent enough that I noticed the pattern even though we usually left around the same time. I asked her about it once, casually in the parking lot. The kind of question you ask a coworker you're fond of, rather than an interrogation. She said she'd been spending some of that extra time in the dining room after hours when it was empty, just sitting there. I asked her why, and she paused long enough before answering that I understood the pause itself was part of the answer, the part she wasn't sure how to put into words yet. She told me she'd started feeling like she owed Tillman something, used almost the same phrase she'd used months earlier, a debt she hadn't realized she still carried. She said sitting in the dining room in roughly the spot where she remembered that wobbly-legged chair used to be made her feel closer to working it out, whatever it was. Though she admitted she couldn't fully explain what it was she felt she needed to work out, only that the feeling had grown heavier rather than lighter the more she indulged it. I want to be honest that this worried me in a very ordinary human way, the kind of worry you'd feel about any friend who seemed to be sinking into a grief or a guilt that didn't have an obvious source. The kind of worry that has nothing to do with ghosts and everything to do with watching someone you care about retreat into themselves. I encouraged her to talk to someone, a counselor, even just her primary doctor. Framed it as exhaustion, as the toll of working overnights for as many years as she had, which was true regardless of whatever else might also be true. She said she'd think about it. I don't know if she ever did. The dining room incident happened on a night in February, cold enough outside that the windows along the east wall had frosted over on the inside, something I'd never seen happen in that building before despite 2 full winters there already, which the facilities team later blamed on a failed seal somewhere in that wing's window casings. An explanation that satisfied exactly nobody who'd actually been there that night. I came through the dining room around 4 a.m. doing a final check before the kitchen staff started arriving for breakfast prep and found one of the dining chairs pulled out from its table and positioned slightly askew, angled toward an empty seat beside it, the way you'd pull a chair close to sit next to someone rather than across from them. I didn't think much of it at first. Residents wandered at night, sometimes moved furniture for reasons that made sense only to them, and I started to push it back into place. That was when I noticed the leg. The chair had a wobble to it, a genuine physical mechanical wobble, the kind caused by a loose joint or an uneven leg length, the kind you'd notice the instant you sat in it or even just nudged it against the floor. I'd eaten in that dining room more times than I could count, on quick breaks, at odd hours, and I had never once sat in or noticed a wobbly chair among the dozen or so that filled the room. I checked the others nearby. None of them wobbled. Just that one, in that position, angled toward an empty chair. On the same night, the windows had frosted over from the inside in a wing that had never frosted before. I don't have an explanation for that chair that satisfies me completely even now. I've turned it over more times than I can count. Furniture does wear unevenly over years of use, and it's entirely possible that particular chair had always had a slight wobble that I'd simply never happened to notice or use during 2 years of irregular, half-attentive interactions with dining room furniture during quiet, overnight hours. I want to give that explanation its due weight, because I think it's important Not to pretend, for the sake of a better story, that I had certainty where I genuinely only had unease. But the timing, positioned exactly where Renata had described Tillman's chair, sitting beside Walter all those months earlier, on a night already strange enough in other ways, was more than I could comfortably file away as ordinary wear and tear. I didn't mention the chair to Renata. I'm still not entirely sure why, except that some instinct in me, maybe a protective one, maybe a self-protective one, didn't want to feed whatever was already growing in her with one more piece of evidence that might encourage rather than ease whatever she was working through alone in that empty dining room after her shifts. Around this same period, Walter's questions started changing in small ways I hadn't heard before. After months and months of the exact same phrasing, delivered with the exact same calm consistency, he started asking some nights whether Tillman had said anything about him. He started asking on a couple of occasions if I'd told her about the chair, as though our earlier conversation about his apology had set some ongoing exchange in motion that he expected me to continue facilitating, the way you'd check in with a mutual friend about whether a message you'd passed along had actually been received. One night, close to the end of February, he asked me something that I still haven't found a comfortable way to think about. He asked in the same, even unbothered tone he asked everything in, whether I thought she was angry with him. I asked him why he thought she might be angry. He said he didn't know exactly, said it was more of a feeling than a thought. The way you sometimes know someone's upset with you before they've said anything, just from the air in a room. He said the feeling had gotten stronger the past couple of weeks. Said he found himself apologizing more, even though he still couldn't entirely remember what for. Beyond the chair, which he kept circling back to like it was the one fixed point he could hold on to in an otherwise fogged over memory. I told him I didn't think anyone could be angry with him, that he was a kind man, and everyone who knew him thought well of him, which was true and which I meant sincerely, and which did absolutely nothing to settle whatever unease was sitting behind his eyes that night. He thanked me anyway, the way he always thanked staff for small kindnesses, regardless of whether those kindnesses had actually solved anything. And I left his room that night carrying a feeling I hadn't carried before in 2 years of working there. Something closer to dread than curiosity. The sense that whatever this was had stopped being a puzzle I might eventually solve and started being something with its own momentum, moving forward whether I understood it or not. The sealed closet finally came up again in March, not because of anything I did, but because corporate, after what I assume was an unrelated and entirely mundane capital improvements push, finally approved the asbestos remediation work order that Hector had told me more than a year earlier could take months to clear. A 2-man abatement crew came in on a weekday to properly assess and seal or remove whatever was actually back there. And Hector, who walked them through the building, asked if I wanted to see what they found, since he knew by then, without my ever fully explaining why, that I had some kind of ongoing interest in that particular corner of the building. I went down on my break that night, after the crew had finished, and left their equipment staged for the next day's continuation, and Hector showed me into the small space behind the gray door, lit now by a portable work light, clamped to a ladder, rather than the building's own wiring, since the closet's original fixture had apparently failed decades ago and never been replaced. It was smaller than I'd imagined, barely large enough for 2 people to stand in comfortably, shelving along one wall that had mostly collapsed under its own weight and age. Old cleaning supplies, fused into solid blocks by decades of temperature swings, the kind of forgotten utility space every old building accumulates somewhere in its less visited corners. Tucked into the back corner, behind the collapsed shelving, was a small cardboard box that had survived in better condition than almost anything else in the room, protected, I suppose, by the very shelf that had fallen and covered it. Hector pulled it out, more out of professional thoroughness than any sense of significance. The kind of habit that comes from years of needing to document anything found during remediation work in case it mattered to someone's liability paperwork later. Inside were a handful of personal items, the kind of small, accumulated belongings that collect at the bottom of a locker or a desk drawer over years of employment. A cardigan, moth-eaten badly enough that its original color was hard to determine. A coffee mug with a chipped handle. A small framed photograph, glass cracked diagonally across one corner, showing a woman in nurse's scrubs standing beside an elderly man in a wheelchair, both of them smiling at whoever was holding the camera. The kind of casual staff photo that gets taken constantly in places like this and almost never printed, let alone framed. I asked Hector if he knew who the box belonged to. He turned it over, found a faded strip of masking tape on the bottom with a name written on it in handwriting, gone soft and gray with age, the ink barely legible. C. Tillman. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Hector didn't either, though I noticed him glance at me sideways. The way you glance at someone when you suspect they know something about a situation that you yourself have decided not to ask about. He said something about turning the box over to Carol, since it technically belonged to a former employee's estate, whatever remained of one more than a decade after her death. And that wasn't his department to sort out. I asked if I could look at the photograph for just a minute before he took the box upstairs. He let me, and I studied the man in the wheelchair carefully, comparing him as best I could to a face I'd seen almost every working night for 2 years, allowing for the obvious difference in age, since whoever this photograph was taken of would have been considerably younger than Walter looked now, if it was him at all. I couldn't be certain. I want to be honest about that because certainty would make for a cleaner story, and this isn't a clean story. The man in the photograph had a similar build to Walter, similar hairline, but the photograph was old and slightly out of focus, and the man's face was turned at an angle that made full comparison difficult. It could have been Walter, 20 years younger, at some point during a stay that, according to every piece of paperwork the facility had ever shown me, never happened, since he hadn't moved in until years after Tillman had died. Or it could have been someone else entirely, another resident, another nurse's co-worker, a friend from outside the facility, anyone. I gave the box back to Hector and didn't tell him what I thought I might have recognized, partly because I genuinely wasn't sure, and partly because some instinct in me had started, by that point, treating every new piece of information as something to be carried carefully and not handed off lightly, the way you'd carry something fragile through a crowded room. What happened to Renata happened about a week after that, and I want to tell this part as plainly as I can, because I think the plainness of it is what makes it sit so heavily with me even now. I was the one who picked up the extra coverage that night, which is part of why I remember the timeline so precisely. The on-call supervisor called me a little after 11, asked if I could come in early to cover Renata's shift, since nobody had heard from her. And I remember the specific, dull dread of that call, the kind you get whenever a phone rings outside its normal hours, before you even know what it's about. I drove in faster than I should have, half expecting to hear she'd been in an accident, and spent the first 2 hours of that shift distracted, doing my rounds on autopilot, while some part of my brain stayed parked on the unanswered question of where she actually was. She didn't show up for her shift on a Tuesday night, which had never happened in the entire time I'd known her, not once, not even during a bad flu season that took down half the floor staff for a week the previous winter. The on-call supervisor tried calling her, got no answer, and eventually sent someone to do a wellness check at her apartment. Standard procedure for any employee who goes silent without notice, especially one with as long and reliable a tenure as Renata's. She was fine physically. That's the detail I want to lead with, because everything else about that night could easily be misread as something far worse than what it actually was, and she deserves better than to have her worst night flattened into a ghost story. She was alive, unharmed, sitting on her own living room floor when the wellness check arrived, surrounded by what the responding aide later described to me, somewhat shaken herself, as photographs and old printed schedules and a handful of laminated staff badges going back years. The kind of memorabilia that accumulates in a long career, all of it spread out around her in a pattern that didn't seem random, though nobody who saw it could quite say what the pattern actually was. Renata told the supervisor, and later told me herself during a phone call I almost didn't take because I assumed at first it was a wrong number, given how late she called, that she'd spent the entire day going through old boxes she hadn't opened in years, looking for anything connected to Tillman, and that somewhere in the middle of that search, she'd lost track of time so completely that an entire missed shift had passed without her once checking a clock. She told me in a voice that didn't sound entirely like her own, quieter, flatter, that she'd finally remembered something she said she'd been trying to remember for months. She said she remembered being on shift the night Tillman died. Said she remembered it had happened in the building, not at home, not somewhere else, as some of the other versions had suggested, and that she remembered being told afterward very firmly by administration at the time never to discuss what she'd seen. I asked her what she'd seen. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. She said she didn't actually know anymore. She said she could remember being told to forget it with absolute clarity. Remembered the instruction itself in vivid detail, the where and the who and the exact phrasing used. But the thing she'd actually witnessed, that the instruction was protecting, had somehow not survived alongside the memory of being silenced, as if the order to forget had succeeded perfectly with one part of the memory, while leaving the surrounding scaffolding of it eerily intact. I didn't know what to say to that. I'm not sure there was anything adequate to say. I told her to get some rest. Told her I was glad she was safe. Told her we'd talk more when she was back on shift. And I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after we hung up, in my own dark apartment, feeling further from any kind of explanation than I had at any point since that very first night Walter had asked me, with such calm, unbothered certainty, if Tillman was working. Renata came back to work about 10 days later, on modified light duty at first, mostly paperwork and supervision rather than direct resident care. A compromise her doctor and the facility had apparently worked out together. She seemed steadier than I expected, though there was a quality to her now that hadn't been there before. A kind of careful distance, as though she'd decided, somewhere during those 10 days off, to stop letting herself fall any further into whatever she'd been falling into. She didn't bring up Tillman again. Not with me. Not as far as I ever heard with anyone else. When I gently tried to check in about it once, she told me, kindly but firmly, that she'd said everything she had to say on the subject and that she needed to leave it where it was for her own sake. I respected that, and I never raised it with her again. That left me, by early April, more or less alone with it. Whatever this was had started as something I'd half stumbled into out of idle curiosity, then become something I'd actively investigated out of a mix of genuine concern and what I'll admit was a less noble fascination, and had finally settled into something closer to a private burden, a thing I carried through my shifts without anyone left to share the weight of it with. Walter's condition began to change around the same time in ways that had nothing to do with Tillman directly, but that I think mattered to how everything eventually concluded. He had a fall in late March, nothing catastrophic, a stumble getting out of bed too quickly in the dark. But it was enough to trigger a more thorough medical workup than he'd had in years. And that workup turned up some early signs of cognitive decline that hadn't been documented before, mild enough that it wouldn't have changed his level of care immediately, but present in a way his chart had never reflected previously. It was, his doctor noted, not unusual for a man his age, and it didn't strike anyone on staff as connected to anything else going on. But I remember feeling a strange kind of grief reading that note in his chart. The sense that whatever clarity Walter had carried through every other version of this story, the clarity that had made his Tillman question so unsettling, precisely because he seemed otherwise so reliably himself, might not hold much longer. The last night I want to describe in real detail happened in the middle of April on a shift that started like almost every other shift I'd worked there, and ended like none of them. It had been raining since early evening, the steady, unhurried kind of spring rain that doesn't let up for hours, audible against the windows in every quiet hallway, a sound I'd always found oddly comforting on previous nights, something about it making the building feel smaller and more contained, easier to hold in your attention all at once. That night it didn't feel comforting. It felt like the building was being sealed off from everything outside it. The rain a kind of curtain, drawn between whatever was happening inside those walls and the ordinary world going about its business beyond them. I checked on Walter around 1:30, same as always, and found his door open, lamp on, same as that very first night, so many months earlier. He was sitting up, alert, looking toward the closet again, the way he had that night in December, and I felt something settle into my chest that I can only describe as a held breath. I didn't remember choosing to hold. He asked his question, the same question, the one I'd heard so many times by then that I could have predicted the exact rhythm of his voice, asking it, "Is Tillman working tonight?" I didn't give him my usual non-answer. I don't entirely know why that particular night was different, except that something about the rain and the months of accumulated unease, and Renata's strange, flattened voice on the phone, and the box in the supply closet with its cracked photograph, had worn down whatever professional caution had kept me redirecting him gently for nearly a year and a half. I asked him instead if he could tell me what he remembered about her, not what he thought I should know. Not the chair, which he'd already told me about more than once by then, but anything at all, whatever came to mind first. He was quiet for a while, longer than his usual pauses, long enough that I wondered if he'd lost the thread of the question entirely, which happened sometimes now since the fall in ways it hadn't before. Then he said she used to sing very softly, almost under her breath. While she did rounds, said it wasn't really singing so much as humming with occasional words mixed in, and that he'd never been able to place the song, had asked her about it once, and she'd laughed and said it wasn't really a song at all, just something her own mother used to hum, passed down without a name attached to it anymore. He said she used to bring him hard candy from her coat pocket, the same hard candy his late wife used to keep in a dish by the front door, and that the first time she did it, he'd cried right there in front of her, embarrassed but unable to stop. And she hadn't made a fuss about it, had just sat with him until he was done. I asked him as gently as I could manage whether he understood that the facility's records showed she had died years before he ever moved in, that by every account except his own, they should never have met at all. He looked at me for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. Not confusion exactly, more like the look of someone being asked to defend a fact they've never once had reason to question. The way you might react if someone asked you to prove your own name. He said, "Then how would I know about the chair?" I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't. He said something else after that, quieter, almost to himself rather than to me, that I've turned over more than anything else in this entire story. He said maybe some people don't leave all at once. Maybe some part of them stays behind to finish what they didn't get to finish, and it just takes the rest of us a while to notice they're still working. I asked him what he thought she still had to finish. He shook his head slowly and said he didn't know. Said maybe it wasn't even about her. Said maybe it was about him. About whatever debt he still felt he owed her for the kindness she'd shown a grieving old man who'd cried over a piece of hard candy. A debt that had outlasted his own certainty about whether the woman who'd given it to him had ever actually been real in the way the rest of the world understood real. I sat with him for a long while after that, not saying much, mostly just present in the room while the rain kept going outside, and at some point, I genuinely don't know exactly when, I became aware of a faint smell in the room that hadn't been there when I came in. Something floral, slightly old-fashioned, the kind of scent you associate with a particular era of hand lotion or perfume rather than anything currently sold. The kind of smell that triggers a feeling of familiarity in people far older than you without your having any independent reference point for it yourself. I never mentioned that smell to anyone. I'm not entirely sure why, except that by that point in the story, some part of me had stopped wanting external confirmation of things I genuinely could not explain. Had started preferring instead to simply hold them privately, the way you hold a dream you don't fully trust yourself to describe accurately once you're fully awake. I left his room a little before 2 that night, and I checked, out of habit more than anything else by then, on the old supply closet on my way past, fully repaired now, the abatement work finished weeks earlier. New drywall and a fresh coat of paint, covering whatever had been back there for the better part of 2 decades. The groaning in the vents, the sound that had first drawn my attention to that stretch of hallway all those months ago had stopped entirely, sometime during the repair work, and never come back. I don't know what that means. I've never been able to decide whether it means anything closed or whether it simply means something moved somewhere I no longer had reason to walk past. Walter's decline accelerated over the following months, faster than I think anyone expected, given how sharp he'd seemed for so long before that. By early summer, he'd moved from Sunrise to Heritage, the locked memory care wing, after a series of incidents that made it clear he could no longer safely manage independently. Incidents involving wandering, involving confusion about time and place that none of us had seen from him before. The kind of decline that families always hope will be slow, and is so often, instead, abrupt once it finally starts in earnest. I didn't work Heritage regularly. My assignment kept me mostly in Sunrise and Magnolia, so my contact with him after the transfer became occasional rather than nightly, the kind of contact you have with someone who used to be a fixture in your daily life and has become, through no fault of either of you, a person you only see in passing. The last time I spoke with him directly, he was sitting in a chair by the window in the Heritage Common Room on an afternoon visit I'd made on my own time, technically off the clock, because I'd wanted to check on him and the daytime schedule didn't otherwise give me a reason to be in that wing. He didn't fully recognize me, not in the way he once had. Called me by the name of someone else, an aide who'd left the facility over a year earlier. And I didn't correct him, because correcting him would have served no one, least of all him. I asked him, even though some part of me knew by then it wasn't fair to ask a man in his condition to provide the kind of clarity I was still looking for, whether he remembered Tillman. He looked at me for a long moment, the late afternoon light catching the side of his face through the window, and he said, with a small, genuine smile that I think about more often than almost anything else from those 2 years. She still comes by sometimes, not every night anymore, but she still comes by. I asked him if she'd said anything. He said, "She's not angry anymore. I think we're square." That was the last real conversation we had. I left the facility myself about 4 months after that, for reasons that had very little to do with any of this. Mostly just burnout, the ordinary kind that eventually catches up with almost everyone who works overnight, care for long enough. The kind that has nothing to do with ghosts, and everything to do with how unsustainable it is to live your whole adult life out of sync with the people you love. I took a daytime job in an unrelated field. I still think about the residents often, Walter most of all, and I made a point in the months right after I left of calling the front desk occasionally just to check on him, a courtesy they allowed for a former employee who'd cared about a specific resident, until eventually a kind voice on the other end of the phone told me gently that Walter had passed away peacefully in his sleep. No specific incident, just the slow accumulation of age, finally reaching its natural conclusion, the way it does for almost everyone, fortunate enough not to be taken by something faster and crueler first. I didn't go to the service. I'm not sure I would have been welcome there in any official capacity, a former overnight aide who'd known him for 2 years out of his 80-some. And some part of me also didn't want to be in a room full of people offering tidy explanations for a life I'd come to understand as anything but tidy. I thought in the days after I got that phone call about Dot and about Frank, and about whether either of them was even still alive to hear the news. Since both of them were old enough by the time I left that I'd long since stopped assuming any given absence from the floor was simply a day off. I never found out what happened to either of them. I lost the thread of the facility's daily life almost completely once I stopped working there. The way you lose track of a television show after you stop watching it partway through a season. The characters continuing on somewhere without you. Their fates unfolding in episodes you'll never see. I think about that loss of access more than I expected to, given how willingly I walked away from it at the time. There's something strange about caring deeply for people for 2 years in the specific, intimate way caregiving work requires, and then simply not knowing for the rest of your life how their stories ended. I never got a clean answer to any of this, and I want to be honest with you about that rather than inventing one for the sake of a satisfying ending, because I don't think this kind of story deserves a satisfying ending, and I'm not sure I'd trust myself if I tried to give you one. I don't know if Tillman died once, the way the paperwork claimed years before Walter ever arrived. And Walter's mind somehow absorbed details about her from overheard staff conversation that lodged so deep they became indistinguishable from lived memory. I don't know if she died later, the way Renata insisted, after Walter had already moved in and after they'd already spent real, ordinary, human time together over hard candy and a wobbly dining chair, and the facility quietly altered or mishandled its own records in the aftermath of whatever sensitive separation Carol never finished explaining to me. I don't know if there was some kind of cover-up connected to a resident's death that Tillman was blamed for. The version Esther gave me with so much hesitation in her voice, or whether that story was itself just one more piece of institutional folklore, passed down kitchen to kitchen over 20 years until nobody left could say where it had actually originated. And I don't know what to do with the chair, or the smell in Walter's room that night, or the voices behind a sealed closet door that I heard clearly enough to remember the texture of all these years later, even though I can't reproduce a single word of what was actually said. Or Renata, sitting alone on her living room floor, surrounded by old badges and photographs, remembering with absolute clarity that she'd been told to forget something, while the something itself stayed gone. What I keep coming back to, more than any individual detail, is the shape of the whole thing. An old man asking the same gentle question every night for years about a woman the world had agreed, on paper at least, no longer existed. And underneath that question, a building full of people who'd each carried their own fractured, contradictory piece of her, none of them lining up, none of them willing to compare their version against anyone else's closely enough to notice the cracks, until a tired 20-something with too much time on his hands during slow overnight shifts started asking the wrong kind of questions in the wrong kind of basement. I think about memory differently now than I did before I worked there. I used to think of it as something closer to a photograph, a fixed, if sometimes faded, record of what actually happened. I don't think that anymore. I think memory is more like a conversation that keeps happening long after the people in it have stopped being available to participate. A conversation that the living keep having on behalf of the dead, filling in whatever gaps feel unbearable to leave empty, until eventually nobody involved can fully say anymore which parts were lived and which parts were simply needed. I don't know if Walter actually met her. I don't know if some genuine, unexplainable remnant of a woman named Tillman really did walk those halls long after her own death, looking for whatever unfinished thing kept drawing her back, settling an old man's grief, one hard candy and one apology at a time. I don't know if the whole building, staff and residents alike, had simply absorbed an old, sad piece of institutional history so deeply that it started manifesting in small, human, explicable ways that only looked uncanny from the outside, looked uncanny to me specifically, because I'd arrived without the context that might have let me see it as ordinary, the way everyone else apparently had. And I only know that some nights, even now, working a perfectly ordinary daytime job in a building with no history I'm aware of, I'll be alone in a quiet hallway, and I'll think I hear two voices talking low, somewhere just out of sight, and for half a second before my rational mind catches up and explains it away, I find myself wondering whether somewhere, in some facility I no longer have access to, there's a new overnight aide hearing an old man ask, for the first time, whether a woman named Tillman happens to be working that night, and whether that aide, like I did, will tell him they don't know, and whether, like me, they'll spend years afterward wishing they'd asked him more questions while he could still answer them, instead of waiting until all that was left of him was a kind smile, by a window telling me, with more peace than I ever managed to find in the same situation, that whatever debt had stood between them all that time had finally, quietly, been paid.